Hello, this is Ed Chapman, and this video cast is going to focus on the biology of acids and bases. First and most important is the idea that living cells generally prefer to live in aqueous solutions or in water solutions that are between a pH of 6 and 8. We refer to this as the zone of life, and it's centered on neutral pH, which is 7. Of course, there are always exceptions. There are some bacteria, for example, that can tolerate really, really low pH or acidic conditions. We associate these with volcanoes and geysers and hot springs and things like that. But we're going to ignore those guys for right now. The pH scale is simply a measurement of hydrogen ion concentration. Now, in biology and chemistry, we represent these things, hydrogen ions, with the symbol H+. And all this means is a proton. It's just a hydrogen atom that's lost its electron. So when you talk about hydrogen ions, you're actually talking about naked protons, so to speak. Strong acids are chemicals that when you mix them with water, they release a lot of hydrogen ions. And you should know some examples of some strong acids. You probably know this one, and you probably know this one. Okay, this one is hydrochloric acid. It's the most common acid in our stomachs, and sulfuric acid, which is something that's found in acid rain. So two strong acids, when you mix them with water, they release lots and lots of hydrogen ion. Now, strong bases are chemicals that do just the opposite. They release a lot of hydroxide ion when you mix them with water. And hydroxide ions are represented as OH minus, and some strong bases you're probably familiar with, probably the most important one is sodium hydroxide, NaOH, which is the main ingredient in drain cleaner, something you do not want to get on your skin or in your eyes. Some nasty stuff. But when you mix sodium hydroxide with water, it causes the pH to go way up. And it, of course, raises pH. That makes it a base. The cool thing about acids and bases is they kind of cancel each other out when you mix them together. So, for example, if we took some sodium hydroxide and we mixed it with some hydrochloric acid and some water, okay, not something I'd recommend you do because this is a very exothermic reaction. It's going to produce as a byproduct a lot of heat. Okay, so this is not something you play around with. But if you mix these three things together, what you end up with is some sodium ion, some chlorine ion, hydrogen ions, and hydroxide ions. Now, these two, of course, are going to combine to make regular old table salt, and these two are going to combine to make, or what we call plain old water. So what you end up with when you mix acids and bases is salt water. And if you do the balancing just right, you'll end up with a neutral pH. Now, the math of pH, what do all these numbers mean? Where do they come from? All right, well, this all comes from some algebra here. What we do know is the concentration of hydroxide ions multiplied by the concentration of hydrogen ions is always equal to 10 to the negative 14. So basically what they're saying here is that plain old water, neutral, pure distilled water, will break down into hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions. This is called dissociation. This will happen at a very, 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 very small rate. So this is only going to happen 1 over 10 to the 14th, which is 10 with a lot of zeros here. It's a very rare event. So from this, we can get the two concentrations. So the hydroxide ion concentration is going to be 1 times 10 to the negative 7. And the hydrogen ion concentration is going to be 1 times 10 to the negative 7. Of course, and when you multiply exponents, you add them together. So you can see how we get that. So this is where the 7 for neutral comes from. So if the concentration of hydroxide ions and hydrogen ions is balanced, we have a neutral pH. So you can see where 7 comes from as neutral. That's kind of like the magic number in pH. Now, what this means is if I tell you, or somebody tells you that you have a container of water, and we say that this water has a pH of 8, okay, what that means is the hydrogen ion concentration, and we use these little brackets to represent concentration, is equal to 1 times 10 to the negative 8. You see it? So what's the hydroxide ion concentration in this solution? Well, that's very easy to figure out. What's 14 minus 8? It's 6, right? So that means that the hydroxide ion concentration has to be equal to that. And because these two numbers have to always add up to negative 14. So if you know the pH, you can always figure out the hydroxide ion concentration. Just a little math there to be aware of. But the numbers in the pH scale are actually coming from these exponents here. So they're the negative or the opposite of the, so it would be multiply negative 8 times negative 1 gives you 8. So that's how we get the pH scale. Not going to go any deeper than that. Logarithms are involved, and those still scare me. All right, buffers. Buffers are chemicals that resist changes in pH. So if you have a buffered solution, a lot of times in biology when you're doing labs and things, you'll be using buffered solutions. These are solutions that have had chemicals called buffers added to them, which keep the pH from changing even if you add acids and bases to them, to a degree. Of course, nothing lasts forever. You can always exhaust buffers. For example, if you have buffered a solution and you add an acid to it, the pH is not going to fall very much. And conversely, if you add a base to a buffered solution, the pH is not going to rise very much. Now, the most important buffer in biology, or the easiest example that I think to understand, is human blood. Human blood has a pH of approximately 7.2, and you're not going to feel very good if the pH of your blood rises or falls very much beyond this. So evolution has given us a buffering system which maintains pH of your blood at about 7.2. And this is accomplished with two different substances, carbonic acid and bicarbonate. These are chemicals and ions that play an important role in the buffering of human blood. And let me see if I can work through this math for you. First thing is when you breathe, okay, and your body uses oxygen, it produces carbon dioxide. And CO2 mixed with water produces a chemical called carbonic acid. And carbonic acid is H2CO3. And H2CO3, this is called carbonic acid. Now, carbonic acid acts as a buffer, and let me show you how that works. Get rid of this. All right, now carbonic acid, H2CO3, will dissociate into HCO3 minus plus H plus. So that means carbonic acid is a weak acid because remember, acids release hydrogen ions. So carbonic acid, when you mix with water, produces this thing, which is called a bicarbonate ion or bicarbonate, and H plus. All right. So if the pH of your blood rises, okay, the carbonic acid that's in your blood, because you have CO2 in your blood, the carbonic acid in your blood disassociates and produces hydrogen ions, and that pushes the pH back down. Remember, so if the pH is rising, becoming more basic, then this disassociates to produce hydrogen ions. The hydrogen ions combine with the hydroxide ions, which are raising the blood's pH, and cause it to come back down. This is the buffering activity. Now, this can also go in the other direction. All right, if your blood starts to become too acidic, all right, the hydrogen ions will be absorbed by or will combine with bicarbonate ions to produce H2CO3, take these guys out of solution, and it will raise your pH. So the interaction of carbonic acid and bicarbonate ions in your blood is what keeps your blood's pH at approximately 7.2. Very, very important effect. Keeping a stable blood pH is a big part of homeostasis. Now, acids also are bad sometimes in the environment. You probably have heard about global warming and the increase. We do know, it's documented very well, that the carbon dioxide level of our atmosphere has been rising very quickly for pretty much since people have been burning fuels like coal and petroleum. And increases in CO2 level, if you remember what CO2 does. CO2 combines with water to produce H2CO3, which is carbonic acid. Carbonic acid, remember, it releases hydrogen ions. So when the atmosphere's CO2 level increases, the CO2 combines with ocean water and causes ocean water to become more and more acidic. And we do know that this acidity, this increased acidity or this lower pH, can interfere with corals. Okay, if you probably remember, coral animals are little jellyfish relatives that build this rocky material that builds coral reefs. And also most marine or many marine organisms like crabs and lobsters and shrimp and clams and oysters, they all build shells. And to do this, they have to work with calcium in the water. And increases in carbonic acid interfere with this calcium chemistry and interfere with proper shell formation in many animals. So a lot of scientists are worried about CO2 levels causing ocean acidification. Another problem is acid rain. Okay, again, it's the exact same chemistry. Carbon dioxide plus water produces that acid, that carbonic acid we talked about. And if this happens in the atmosphere, we get acid rain. It isn't just CO2. There are also other things like sulfates and nitrates that can combine with water and produce other acids. So these acids cause the pH of rain to become very low, and this can have terrible, terrible effects on ecosystems. When it runs through the soil, it can leach out calcium and other minerals. The acidity itself can damage tissues. If you've ever gotten lemon juice in your eye, you know how it burns. So this can be bad. Acids in the environment can produce negative effects. That's it, and we'll pick up later on another video cast.